Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. And welcome to another Stories from Maine podcast. In this episode, we will hear the true and legendary story of one Maine congressman, who while a member of the United States House of Representatives, took part in a duel to the death with a congressman from Kentucky. When it was over, one man lay dead, and American history would be forever changed. Stay with us for the story of The Last Duel, right here on Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine podcast for the final week of January 2025. The book series, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, are authored by Maine historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books are available from all booksellers and through Amazon. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. You can also read our all-new Stories from Maine articles in each weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times-Record. Look for our weekly stories online, or pick up your copy of the Times-Record on newsstands each Friday.
In our next segment of This Week in Maine History, we take a look back at January 29th of 1890, when United States Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed, a Republican congressman from Portland, Maine, takes action to end the tactic known as the disappearing quorum. This political tactic was primarily used by House Democrats in an effort to prevent the business of the nation from being conducted within the House of Representatives. Reed also abolished the political tactic of the filibuster, another stalling practice used in the House of Representatives. Although the stalling tactic of the filibuster is still used today in the United States Senate, Reed's efforts forever changed the way business was conducted in the United States House of Representatives. Now, let's head over to Oscar for this week's feature story, The Last Duel.
Divisiveness in Washington has always been a part of the American political landscape, even in the early days when America's founding fathers debated the causes of independence from Great Britain. Arguments, insults, and even violent assaults have taken place, and some were notorious. In 1804, the most well-known of all such violent events took place in Weehawken, New Jersey, where sitting United States Vice President Aaron Burr and former U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton squared off, pistols in hand, for a final showdown. When it was over, Alexander Hamilton was dead, killed by Burr with one shot. But the final duel between political adversaries was still more than 3 decades away. On February 24th of 1838, two men met on neutral ground in Maryland. One man was from Kentucky. The other man was from Maine. Both men were armed and determined to kill the other, and both men were members of the Congress of the United States of America. Jonathan Silly was a United States congressman from Thomaston, Maine, in what was then Maine's 3rd District. He had been elected to Congress in November of 1836, and he took his seat on March 4th of 1837. Silly had served in the Maine House of Representatives from 1831 to 1836, and he served as Speaker of the Maine House from 1835 to 1836, when he resigned to serve in Congress. Jonathan Silly was born in Nottinghamshire, in New Hampshire, on July 2nd of 1802. He then came to Maine and was schooled at Bowdoin College. As a member of Bowdoin's illustrious class of 1825, Silly was friends with fellow classmates and notable future literary legends Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, as well as future United States President Franklin Pierce. Silly soon became a lawyer, and he married Deborah Prince of Thomaston. Together, the couple had 5 children, and they enjoyed an extensive family in the Thomaston area. Although Silly was admitted to the bar as an attorney in 1828, he accepted a position as editor of the Thomaston Register newspaper from 1829 until he won election as a member of the Maine State House of Representatives from Thomaston in 1831. Afterwards, Silly went to Washington. By February of 1838, the atmosphere within the U.S. Congress was venomous, with partisanship reaching an all-time low. Silly had just completed his first year in Congress, and he determined to have words with James W. Webb, the editor of the New York Courier and Inquirer, who had been particularly vitriolic in his printed opinions of Congress and of Silly. The exchange between Webb and Silly was bitter and heated, and Silly took to the floor of Congress to remonstrate Webb. Silly leveled accusations of corruption against Webb from the floor of Congress, and his bitter rant caught the ear of all in session. When word of the verbal tirade upon him had reached Webb, he became incensed and demanded satisfaction, a return of his honor and dignity. Webb then issued a challenge to Silly to a fight, a duel to the death. Webb was no stranger to dueling. In fact, Webb had acted as a second to Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay when Clay dueled with Representative Humphrey Marshall in 1809. Clay was a man known for his challenges and duels with political opponents. Interesting to note, Clay, considered by most in Congress to be a great political diplomat, is better known today as the Great Compromiser. But Webb had no interest in diplomacy or compromises, and he soon sent his friend, Kentucky Congressman William Graves, to serve Jonathan Silly with a challenge to a duel. But Silly outright refused Webb's challenge, and Graves himself now felt insulted and dishonored by Silly. Graves then set aside Webb's challenge in favor of his own, and formally challenged Silly by slapping the Maine congressman in the face with an empty glove. This time, Silly accepted the challenge, but dueling was prohibited within the boundaries of the District of Columbia, where Washington is located. Thus, a neutral and accommodating ground had to be located, and each challenger was obliged to give consent to the chosen dueling grounds. It wasn't long before Graves and Silly both came to an agreement over the chosen spot, located just over the Washington boundary line at Bladensburg, in Maryland. What happened next would go down in the annals of Maine's true legends and carve out its own place in American history. We'll be right back.
The book series, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, are authored by Maine historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books are available from all booksellers and through Amazon. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. You can also read our all-new Stories from Maine articles in each weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record. Look for our weekly stories online, or pick up your copy of The Times Record on newsstands each Friday. And look for Lori Suzanne Dell's next book, Stories from Maine 3, Mayhem, Murder, and Execution in the Pine Tree State, which is scheduled to be published in May of 2025. Now, let's go over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we go to January 31st of 1945, when a fire engulfs an unlicensed, privately operated daycare and nursery in Auburn, Maine. Though 3 women and 5 children escaped the flames, 16 babies and a nurse are killed in the fire. The operator of the daycare and nursery had been previously cited for code violations by the state of Maine. But, since the operator had delayed in rectifying the violations, Maine state authorities did not act to close the facility before the fire. This incident becomes one of the worst fatal fires in Maine history. Now, let's go back to Oscar for the conclusion of our feature story.
Back in Bladensburg, Maryland, the duel between Jonathan Silly and William Graves was being carefully planned out. Graves was known to be a dead shot with a pistol. Having grown up in Kentucky, where hunting and sportsmanship was a common practice, Graves had lots of experience with a pistol. But Having grown up in Maine and not being inclined to such experiences, Silly was considerably weak with small arms. However, since Silly was the defending challenger, by the laws of the duel, he had the choice of weapons. Knowing Graves was a sure shot with a pistol, Silly surprisingly chose rifles as the weapon of choice, hoping to handicap Graves' advantage, and Silly chose the firing distance of 80 yards. Each man was aided by their second, under the traditional laws of the duel. Graves chose Iowa Congressman George W. Jones to assist him in regaining his lost honor. Jonathan Silly chose Virginia Congressman Henry A. Wise to assist in his defense of the duel. In any duel, the seconds were in charge of preparing the field and the weapons, as well as enforcing the rules of the duel. A table was set up on the chosen grounds, the weapons laid out and inspected by each second. These assistants then prepared their principal's rifle, ensuring each was properly working and properly loaded. Then, each second measured out the dueling distance, marked where each man would begin from. Then they read aloud the rules of the duel. Chosen witnesses, for both the challenger and the defendant, also attended the duel. Each man soon accepted the rules and took possession of their weapons. Then each man took to his mark and turned back to one another. Each cocked the hammer on his rifle and began to walk away from one another as a count to 10 commenced. When each man reached their distance and the counting of 10, each man turned, faced his opponent, lifted his rifle, took aim, and fired. Silly and Graves each stood their ground. Both men aimed and fired their rifles, and both men completely missed their targets. Each second then reloaded their particular rifles, handed them back to their respective principals, and reset the starting position of the duel. Once again the count began, as each man paced out the distance. Both Silly and Graves each stopped. Both men cocked their rifles, each aimed carefully, and both men fired again. And once more, both men missed their targets. Yet again, each assistant carefully reloaded their rifles and again handed the weapons over to their participant. However, each of the principals of the duel agreed that the distance was too far for the rifles to accurately reach their targets, and thus the final placement distance was shortened by 10 yards. Now, each man stood once again, back to back, and each began walking away as the count was made. And for the third time, both Graves and Silly cocked and turned. Both raised their rifles, aimed carefully, and fired. When the smoke had cleared, William Graves stood alone, while Jonathan Silly had fallen to the cold ground, struck in the thigh of his left leg. The duel was over, and Graves had won. For Maine's Congressman Jonathan Silly, not only had he lost the duel, but he was now in danger of losing his life. The wound in his leg was bleeding profusely, as the lead shot from Graves' rifle had opened Silly's femoral artery. Although Virginia Congressman Henry Wise did what he could do to control the bleeding, the wound in Silly's leg was too terrible. Within minutes of the final shots ringing out, Jonathan Silly slowly bled to death. Silly's body was carted back to the Capitol as word of the killing spread like wildfire through both houses of Congress. Jonathan Silly was initially laid to rest in the Congressional Cemetery at Washington, D.C. However, Silly's remains were later removed from the Congressional Cemetery and brought home to Maine. Although a cenotaph remains at the Congressional Cemetery, Congressman Jonathan Silly was reinterred in the Elm Grove Cemetery, back on the rocky coast of Maine at Thomaston. By February 20th of 1839, just 1 year after the duel, Congress passed a law to prohibit dueling between members of Congress. Finally, the honor-restoring tradition of the duel, at least in Washington, had come to an end, and the duel between William Graves and Jonathan Silly had become legendary in the annals of American history as the duel to end all duels in our nation's capital. When word of Silly's demise reached American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne at his Massachusetts home, the novelist took pen in hand to write a tribute to his old and dear college friend. In Hawthorne's Jonathan Silly, the author wrote, "I write with a blunted pen and a head benumbed." Alas, that over the grave of a dear friend, my sorrow for the bereavement must be mingled with another grief, that he threw away such a life in so miserable a cause. For the citizens of the nation, another violent duel had been the failed result of another maddening round of ceaseless partisan bickering, which laid itself out in the seat of democracy at Washington. For the people of Maine, their representative to Congress had been killed in a rather forgotten duel, and at a forgotten place, all of which we now remember in these legendary and nefarious of our Stories from Maine.
We hope that you have enjoyed this weekly podcast episode of Stories from Maine. Come back in February for more tales, legends, icons, biographies, and true historic events found in the nearly forgotten pages of the history of the Pine Tree State. And learn why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. See you next time.
If you have enjoyed this podcast episode, please remember to bookmark us, like us, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. All content aired on Stories from Maine is copyright 2025, all rights reserved. No use of this copyrighted material may be used without the express written permission of author and historian, Lori Suzanne Dell. You can reach Stories from Maine by emailing us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.